By the time they finally brought him down, Edward Teach had taken 5 musket balls to the body. 5. And he was still swinging his cutlass. The sailors surrounding him, Royal Navy men, trained fighters, were backing away from a man who should have already been dead 3 times over. Blood was pouring from more than 20 blade wounds across his arms, his chest, his neck. His coat was shredded. His beard, that famous Blackbeard, was matted and soaked red. And still he would not fall. It took a strike from behind, a Scottish Highlander with a broadsword slashing deep across the back of Blackbeard's neck, to finally end it. The most feared pirate in the Western Hemisphere dropped to his knees on the blood-slicked deck of a Royal Navy sloop, cocked his pistol one last time, and collapsed face first into the planks. That was November 22nd, 1718, and the 5 minutes that preceded that moment were among the most violent, chaotic, and downright terrifying minutes in the entire history of piracy. But to understand how Edward Teach ended up on that deck, surrounded by enemies, fighting like a cornered animal with nothing left to lose, you need to understand the chain of events that put him there, the betrayals, the politics, the greed, and the one fatal mistake that the most dangerous man on the Atlantic Ocean made the night before he died. Now, picture a map, not a modern one, something older, hand-drawn, stained with salt water and candle wax, the kind of map a navigator would have unrolled across a captain's table in the early 1700s. Start in the Caribbean, down in the warm turquoise waters south of Florida, where dozens of islands scatter across the sea like God threw a handful of stones. Nassau in the Bahamas. This was pirate headquarters. The Republic of Pirates, they called it. A lawless port where stolen ships crowded the harbor, where taverns never closed, and where men like Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, and a young Edward Teach drank and plotted and counted their gold. Now trace your finger north. Up the coast of the American colonies, past Spanish Florida, past the Carolinas, and stop right there on the coast of North Carolina, where a thin ribbon of barrier islands stretches for more than 200 miles along the coastline, the Outer Banks. A chain of narrow, windswept sand islands separated from the mainland by a vast, shallow body of water called the Pamlico Sound. Zoom in closer. Find the southernmost tip of that island chain. There is a small island, barely a few miles long, surrounded by treacherous sandbars and shallow channels that shift with every tide. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Ocraoke Island, and tucked behind it, hidden from the open ocean, a deep water channel where a ship could anchor without being seen from passing vessels. The locals would eventually call this channel Teach's Hole. This is where Blackbeard made his last camp. This is where he threw his last party. And this is where, on a cold November morning, 2 sloops flying the British naval ensign came around the sandbar and changed the history of piracy forever. But before we get to that morning, you need to know who Edward Teach actually was. Because the legend and the man are 2 very different things. Nobody knows exactly where he came from. The best guess, based on the few records that survive, is that he was born around 1680 in the English port city of Bristol. Bristol was one of the busiest maritime cities in Britain at the time, a place where merchant ships, naval vessels, and the occasional privateer crowded the docks. If you grew up in Bristol in the late 1600s and you had any ambition at all, you went to sea. Teach almost certainly served as a privateer during Queen Anne's War, which raged between Britain and France from 1702 to 1713. Privateers were basically legalized pirates. The government gave you a piece of paper called a letter of marque, and that paper said you could attack and rob enemy ships as long as you gave the crown its cut. It was piracy with paperwork. When the war ended in 1713, thousands of experienced sailors and fighters suddenly found themselves unemployed. The skills that made you valuable in wartime, boarding ships, fighting with cutlasses and pistols, navigating treacherous waters, those same skills made you extremely dangerous in peacetime. And for a lot of these men, the transition from privateer to pirate was less of a career change and more of a technicality. Teach ended up in Nassau sometime around 1716, where he fell in with Captain Benjamin Hornigold's crew. Hornigold was one of the founding fathers of the Pirate Republic, a smart and cautious captain who recognized Teach's talent almost immediately. Within months, Hornigold gave Teach his own command, a sloop, and sent him out to prove himself. He proved himself. On November 28, 1717, Teach and Hornigold intercepted a French merchant vessel called La Concorde off the coast of St. Vincent in the Caribbean. La Concorde was a large, well-armed ship that had been running the transatlantic slave trade. Teach captured it, took the crew prisoner, and claimed the vessel as his own. He renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge. He fitted it with 40 guns. He recruited over 300 men. And then he did something that would define him for the rest of his short, violent career. He created a character. The name Blackbeard was not just a description, it was a weapon. Teach grew his beard long and thick, braiding it into sections and tying the braids with small black ribbons. Before battle, he would tuck slow-burning hemp fuses, soaked in saltpeter and lime water, into his hair and beard and light them. The fuses would smolder and smoke, wreathing his face in a gray, sulfurous haze that made him look like something crawling out of the mouth of hell. One contemporary witness wrote that imagination cannot form an idea of a fury from hell to look more frightful. And that was the entire point. Blackbeard understood something that most pirates of his era did not. Fear is more efficient than violence. If your enemy surrenders before you fire a single shot, you keep your crew alive, your ammunition intact, and your ship undamaged. Every fight you avoid is a fight you win without paying a cost. And here is the thing that makes Blackbeard's story so fascinating. For all his terrifying reputation, for all the stories of demonic rage and merciless cruelty, there is not a single documented instance of Edward Teach killing anyone prior to his final battle. Not one. Every account from captured sailors describes a pirate who was rough, intimidating, theatrical, but ultimately restrained. He took their cargo. He took their ships. He occasionally took hostages for ransom, but he let them live. The fear was the product. The violence was mostly performance, and the performance worked. By the spring of 1718, Blackbeard commanded a small fleet of 4 vessels and over 300 men, and he terrorized shipping from the Caribbean to the American colonies with an efficiency that bordered on professional. His most audacious move came in May of 1718, when he sailed his fleet directly into the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, one of the wealthiest and most important ports in colonial America, and blockaded it. For nearly a week, nothing moved in or out of Charleston Harbor without Blackbeard's permission. He captured 9 ships. He took hostages from some of the city's most prominent families, including a member of the governor's council and his young son. The city was paralyzed. Merchants who depended on Atlantic trade watched their businesses bleed money by the hour. The docks were silent, warehouses overflowed with goods that had nowhere to go, and his ransom demand was not gold, not silver, not jewels. He wanted a chest of medicine. Specifically, he wanted mercury-based treatments for syphilis, which was apparently ravaging his crew. Think about that for a second. The most feared pirate on the ocean held an entire city hostage for antibiotics. Charleston paid. They had no choice. The Royal Navy ships that should have protected the harbor were nowhere near South Carolina, and the city had no defenses capable of taking on a fleet led by a 40-gun warship. Blackbeard got his medicine, released his hostages mostly unharmed, and sailed away into the open Atlantic like nothing had happened. It was the peak of his power, and it was the beginning of the end. Sometime in June of 1718, while navigating the treacherous waters of Beaufort Inlet on the North Carolina coast, the Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground on a sandbar. Whether this was an accident or a deliberate act by Teach is still debated by historians. Some believe he intentionally wrecked his flagship so he could downsize his crew and keep a larger share of the accumulated loot for himself and his closest men. The evidence points toward betrayal. After the grounding, Teach transferred his most trusted crew and the best of the treasure onto a smaller sloop called the Adventure. He then sailed away, leaving dozens of his own men marooned on a barren sandbar with no food, no water, and no ship. Some of them eventually made it to shore. Many did not. With a smaller crew and a smaller ship, Teach sailed north to the tiny settlement of Bathtown, North Carolina. Bath was barely a decade old, with about 100 residents, and it was the colonial capital. The governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, was sympathetic to pirates, or at least to their money. Under the terms of a royal decree that offered pardons to any pirate willing to renounce piracy, Teach walked into Bath and accepted the king's pardon. For a few months, Edward Teach lived as a legitimate citizen. He bought property. He married a local woman, his 14th wife by some accounts. He socialized with Bath's officials, including the governor himself and the colony's collector of customs, a man named Tobias Knight. By all outward appearances, Blackbeard had retired. Nobody who knew him believed it for a second. By late August of 1718, Teach was back at sea. Using the Adventure, he intercepted 2 French merchant ships in the Caribbean, seized their cargo, and brought it back to North Carolina. He presented some of the stolen goods as gifts to Governor Eden and Tobias Knight, further cementing the cozy relationship between the pirate and the colonial government. The rest of the loot he kept for himself and his crew. Word traveled fast, and it traveled north across the colonial border into Virginia, where it landed on the desk of a man who had been watching Edward Teach for months. Alexander Spotswood was the lieutenant governor of Virginia, and he was furious. Spotswood saw Blackbeard as a direct threat to Virginia's shipping lanes and a destabilizing force on the entire Atlantic coast. Pirates harassing vessels in North Carolina waters were costing Virginia merchants real money, and the whispers that Blackbeard might fortify Ocraoke Island itself and turn it into a permanent pirate stronghold made the threat feel existential. Spotswood also saw an opportunity. Capturing or killing the most famous pirate alive would be an enormous boost to his political career and his reputation back in London. There was just one problem. Blackbeard was in North Carolina, and Virginia had absolutely no legal authority to take military action inside another colony's borders without the permission of that colony's governor. Spotswood never asked Governor Eden for permission. He knew Eden would refuse, partly because Eden was likely profiting from Blackbeard's presence, and partly because the request itself would have been an admission that North Carolina could not handle its own affairs. So Spotswood acted in secret. He put up a reward of £100 for Blackbeard's capture, a massive sum worth several years of wages for an ordinary worker. Then he assembled a strike force. The plan was to hit Blackbeard at his camp on Ocraoke Island before anyone could warn him. But Spotswood's warships had a problem. The waters around Ocraoke were far too shallow for the Royal Navy's larger vessels. The labyrinth of sandbars, shoals, and narrow channels that made the Outer Banks such a perfect pirate hideout also made it nearly impossible for deep-draft warships to enter. Spotswood needed smaller boats. He hired 2 civilian sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, and put them under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy. Maynard was 34 years old, experienced, and ambitious. He was given a crew of about 60 men split between the 2 sloops. Neither vessel carried mounted cannon. This was going to be a boarding action from the start. The plan was simple. Find Blackbeard, get close, and take him. Maynard's small fleet departed from the James River in Virginia in mid-November 1718. They sailed south around Cape Henry and into the shallow waters of the Pamlico Sound. Local pilots who knew the treacherous channels guided them through the maze of sandbars toward Ocraoke. They arrived at the inlet on the evening of November 21st. From a distance, through the last light of the day, Maynard's lookout spotted a single mast rising above the low sand hills of Ocraoke Island. The adventure was there. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Blackbeard was home. Maynard wanted to attack immediately, but the incoming darkness and the unfamiliar channels made a night assault too dangerous. One wrong turn and his sloops would be stuck on a sandbar, sitting targets for Blackbeard's guns. He ordered his ships to anchor for the night at the edge of the inlet and wait for dawn. Less than a mile away, completely unaware that a Royal Navy strike force was sitting just outside his anchorage, Edward Teach was having a party. The pirate was drinking with a local trader named Samuel Odell and a handful of his crew aboard the Adventure. Rum flowed freely. The night was loud. Stories were being told, the kind of stories men tell when they have been at sea too long and have too much liquor and not enough fear. Laughter carried across the still water of the inlet. Somewhere on the ship, someone was playing music. The air smelled like salt and tobacco and rum. Blackbeard had no scouts posted, no lookouts watching the inlet. He was confident in his safety. The shallow waters and sandbars that surrounded Ocraoke had always been his greatest protection. No Royal Navy ship could navigate them, and even if someone tried, he would see them coming from miles away. He had anchored in this spot dozens of times. He knew every channel, every shoal, every shifting sandbar. This was his territory, his fortress made of water and sand. He was wrong about that second part. What Blackbeard did not know was that Spotswood's plot had been discovered. Tobias Knight, the North Carolina customs collector who had been helping Blackbeard fence stolen goods, had somehow learned about Maynard's mission and sent Blackbeard a letter warning him. That letter was found on Blackbeard's body after the battle. Whether he received it before or during the festivities that night is unclear. What is clear is that if he read it, he did not take the warning seriously enough. When dawn broke on November 22, 1718, the weather was cold and the water was flat. Maynard ordered his sloops forward at first light, with a small boat ahead taking depth soundings to avoid the sandbars. The two sloops crept through the narrow channels toward Teach's Hole, where the Adventure lay at anchor. Blackbeard's crew spotted them almost immediately. A lookout raised the alarm, and the pirates scrambled to their stations. Blackbeard ordered the Adventure's anchor cable cut, and her sails raised. The ship began to move, trying to find open water and room to maneuver. The two sloops gave chase. But in the rush to close the distance, both the Jane and the Ranger ran aground on a sandbar. They were stuck, and they were now sitting perfectly within range of the Adventure's guns. Blackbeard saw his chance and took it. He ordered the Adventure to come about and fire a broadside directly into the stranded sloops. The Adventure carried between 8 and 10 cannon, along with swivel guns loaded with grape shot and scrap metal. The effect was devastating. The volley ripped through both sloops. On the Ranger, the blast killed 5 men outright, including Midshipman Edmund Hyde, who was serving as the sloop's navigator. Several more were badly wounded. The Ranger was so badly damaged that she was effectively knocked out of the fight. She managed to drift away and run aground again, unable to continue. On the Jane, the casualties were severe, but less catastrophic. Maynard himself survived, but a significant number of his crew were dead or wounded on the deck. In the span of a few seconds, Blackbeard had reduced a 60-man attack force to a crippled, bloodied remnant. And then Robert Maynard did something brilliant. He ordered every man who could still stand to go below decks and hide. He cleared the dead and wounded from view as best he could. When the smoke cleared, anyone looking at the Jane from the Adventure would see what appeared to be a ghost ship, a sloop with a handful of men on deck and bodies everywhere. To all appearances, Blackbeard's broadside had killed nearly everyone aboard. Maynard was gambling everything on one play. He was betting that Blackbeard, seeing a defenseless ship, would do what pirates always did. He would board it. And that is exactly what happened. Blackbeard ordered the Adventure alongside the Jane. His men threw grappling hooks over the rails and lashed the two ships together. Then Blackbeard himself, Edward Teach, the most terrifying figure on the Atlantic Ocean, climbed over the rail and onto the Jane's deck with about 14 of his pirates behind him. What happened in the next 5 minutes is one of the most violent close-quarters engagements in recorded naval history. The moment Blackbeard's boots hit the deck of the Jane, Maynard gave the signal. The hatches burst open. Sailors poured out from below decks, armed with cutlasses, pistols, and boarding axes. The pirates, who had expected to find a ship of dead men, instead found themselves face to face with 35 armed and very angry Royal Navy sailors. The shock lasted about half a second. Then the killing started. The deck of the Jane was narrow, maybe 15 feet across. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to take cover. Within seconds, the space between the masts was a churning wall of blades and bodies. Men were fighting chest to chest, so close that the pistols they fired left powder burns on each other's clothing. The screaming was constant. The deck became so slick with blood that men were slipping and fighting from their knees. Blackbeard was at the center of it all. He fought like a man possessed. He carried multiple pistols and a heavy cutlass, and he used them all. Sailors who tried to engage him one-on-one were cut down or shot. He took a musket ball early in the fight and kept swinging. Then another, then another. Each shot that hit him should have put him on the ground. He absorbed them and kept fighting, driven by adrenaline, fury, or something deeper that nobody watching could quite explain. Robert Maynard pushed through the chaos and engaged Blackbeard directly. The two men squared off in the middle of the slaughter. Maynard fired his pistol and hit Blackbeard. The shot staggered the pirate, but did not stop him. Blackbeard raised his cutlass and brought it down on Maynard's sword with so much force that the blade snapped. Maynard was now unarmed, standing face to face with the most dangerous pirate alive, holding nothing but a broken sword hilt. Blackbeard drew back for the killing blow, and that is when one of Maynard's men, a Scottish Highlander whose name history did not bother to record, stepped in from behind and drove his broadsword into the back of Blackbeard's neck. The cut was deep, savage, and nearly fatal on its own. But Blackbeard still did not fall, not immediately. He spun around, trying to face this new attacker, and as he turned, other sailors closed in. They slashed and stabbed from every direction. Blades came from the left, the right, behind. Each wound was enough to kill an ordinary man, but Blackbeard absorbed them all, still trying to raise his cutlass, still trying to fight. He managed to cock one final pistol. His hand was shaking. Blood was running from everywhere. He got the weapon up, pointed it at someone, and then his body simply gave out. His legs buckled. He dropped to his knees. The pistol clattered to the deck, unfired. And Edward Teach, Blackbeard, the terror of the Atlantic, fell forward onto the blood-soaked planks of the Jane and died. When Maynard examined the body afterward, he counted 5 gunshot wounds and more than 20 cuts from swords and knives. Any 2 or 3 of those wounds should have been fatal. The fact that Blackbeard remained on his feet, fighting through all of them, became one of the most enduring elements of his legend. Without their captain, the remaining pirates collapsed. Some were killed on the deck of the Jane. Others tried to retreat to the Adventure, but were met by the crew from the partially recovered Ranger, who had managed to board the pirate sloop. A few surrendered. The rest were cut down. When the fighting was finally over, 12 of Blackbeard's pirates were dead. The survivors were bound in chains. Maynard's forces had lost at least a dozen men, with many more wounded. The decks of both ships were so saturated with blood that the wood was stained dark for years afterward. And then Maynard did one last thing. He took Blackbeard's severed head and hung it from the bowsprit of the Jane. It would stay there for the entire voyage back to Virginia, a grotesque trophy swinging at the front of the ship, visible to every vessel they passed. Blackbeard's headless body was thrown overboard into the waters of Ocraoke Inlet. Local legend says the body swam 3 laps around the Jane before it sank. That is almost certainly not true. But the fact that people believed it, or wanted to believe it, tells you everything you need to know about the kind of figure Blackbeard had become in the imagination of the colonial world. The surviving pirates were taken to Williamsburg, Virginia, where they were tried and most of them were hanged. The letters found on Blackbeard's body, including the warning from Tobias Knight, created a political scandal that nearly destroyed Governor Spotswood's career. North Carolina officials were outraged that Virginia had conducted an illegal military operation on their soil, and the legal and political fallout dragged on for years. Blackbeard's skull, according to local tradition, was eventually fashioned into a silver-lined drinking chalice. The skull was reportedly coated in silver and passed around among the elite of Virginia as a macabre conversation piece. A local judge even claimed to have drunk from it one night in the 1930s at a private dinner party. Whether that story is true is anyone's guess, but it survived for more than 2 centuries, which says something about the power of the myth. The wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge was discovered in 1996 by a private research firm called Intersal Inc., sitting in about 25 feet of water off the coast of Beaufort, North Carolina. The identity of the wreck was officially confirmed in 2011. Since then, more than 400,000 artifacts have been recovered from the site, including cannons, anchors, navigational instruments, medical equipment, pewter dinnerware, glass beads, and personal items that belonged to Blackbeard's crew. Researchers even found the medical supplies that matched the kind of treatments Blackbeard demanded during the Charleston blockade. The ship is now one of the most thoroughly studied pirate wrecks in history, and a selection of the recovered artifacts is on permanent display at the North Carolina Maritime Museum. On Ocracoke Island, the channel where the battle took place is still called Teach's Hole. You can walk the same shoreline where Blackbeard threw his last party. You can look out over the same shallow water where Maynard's sloops ran aground. And you can stand in the quiet, in the salt air, and imagine what it sounded like on that cold November morning when the gunfire started and the screaming began. Blackbeard's active pirate career lasted roughly 2 years, from 1716 to 1718. That is it. 24 months of terrorizing the Atlantic, blockading cities, capturing ships, and building a reputation so enormous that it has endured for more than 3 centuries. He never accumulated the kind of vast treasure that pirate legends suggest. When Maynard searched the Adventure after the battle, he found no gold coins, no chests of jewels. He found trade goods, cocoa, indigo, cotton, sugar, the mundane cargo of everyday commerce. The treasure of Blackbeard, such as it was, had always been the same thing that made him powerful in the first place: fear. And on November 22, 1718, standing on the deck of the Jane with 5 bullets in his body and 20 cuts bleeding freely, Edward Teach finally encountered the one thing that was more powerful than fear: a man who refused to feel it. The death of Blackbeard did not end piracy in the Americas. Pirates continued to operate in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast for years afterward. But the manner of his death, hunted down by a government-sanctioned strike force, killed in close combat, decapitated, and displayed as a warning, sent a message to every pirate, privateer, and freebooter on the ocean. The Golden Age was over. The governments were coming. and the age of the pirate was giving way to the age of the Navy. 300 years later, Blackbeard remains the most recognizable pirate in history. More famous than Henry Morgan, more iconic than Bartholomew Roberts, who actually captured far more ships. More enduring than any of his contemporaries who lived longer, stole more, and died quieter deaths. And the reason is simple. It is not the years of piracy that made Blackbeard immortal. It is not the ships he captured or the ports he terrorized. It is those last 5 minutes. That final, impossible, horrifying stand on the deck of the Jane, where a man who had spent his entire career avoiding real violence finally had nowhere left to run and chose to fight like something out of a nightmare. 5 gunshot wounds, 20 sword cuts, and he still would not go down until someone took his head. That is the story they kept telling, in taverns and courtrooms and newspapers and books. For 10 years, for 50, for 100, for 3 centuries and counting. Because some stories are too savage, too theatrical, too perfectly human to ever fade. And Blackbeard, even in death, understood the power of a good performance better than anyone.